Bring in my political panel. Jerome Laxall is the Labor member for Bennelong and Zoe McKenzie is the Liberal member for Flinders. And I can say that because all things are declared now. Congratulations to you both and welcome.
Great to be on, PK.
Thanks for having us.
Now, the Prime Minister has announced this productivity roundtable in August. Zoe, that's good news, isn't it? Productivity is an issue in our country, bringing business and unions together to try and nut out what we need to do. That's necessary, isn't it?
Productivity is absolutely a key issue in terms of the Australian economy at the moment, and may I say, has already been for years. We see a very sluggish Australian economy, multiple quarters of negative growth on a per capita basis, and the government's solution is a roundtable. Unbelievable. It's like the Job Summit 2.0, the next edition. The unions didn't get everything they wanted last time. They seemed to get most of what they wanted, as far as I could tell. And now they're going in for more, but this time we're going to call it a productivity roundtable and hope for the best. Frankly, this government could and should be doing a whole lot more. Their most vocal and persuasive voice in relation to artificial intelligence and the productivity uplift it might give this country was Ed Husic. He's now sitting on the backbench. They have much to do in this space, and so we will look with enthusiasm, but frankly, a roundtable is probably not going to cut it.
Jerome, right of reply to you. Is this just a talk fest?
Oh, look, I wouldn't think so. I think that's a pretty cynical take there from Zoe. We saw out of the Jobs and Skills Summit some really good reforms that came through, like free TAFE, adding superannuation to paid parental leave, but also extending the length of paid parental leave. All those was discussed and agreed to at the Jobs and Skills Summit. We heard the Treasurer say the day after the election that they want this term to have productivity as a focus whilst also keeping an eye on inflation. I think a great thing to do is bringing people together. And again, it shows that we're a government that's looking to bring business and unions together, because as the Prime Minister said today, there is common interest for union members, for workers and for businesses. Joint success is good for both those parties, and I think bringing them together, hearing ideas, not prejudging them, and certainly not being cynical about the exercise, I think is important. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it and what ideas are put on the table.
Well, let's talk a little bit about climate and emissions and all of the different issues. I'll start with you, Zoe. I just spoke to Matt Keane. He was, of course, a Liberal Treasurer in New South Wales. He said that the people advocating to just dump net zero in the Liberal Party, that it's weird and that it will lead to electoral oblivion. Will it lead to electoral oblivion if the Liberal Party was to drop its ambitions for net zero by 2050?
Well, we have to remember that we've had net zero as part of settled coalition policy now since 2019. And if you look at what's happened in terms of our performance at the election just passed and the one before, we have gratefully and wonderfully kept our rural and regional seats. Where we have lost seats are in the metropolitan areas. As you know, PK, we have said quite clearly that we must have a deeper conversation with the Australian population about the platform of policies we took to the last election, and we must understand what they wanted to see done differently. You saw the Prime Minister give a speech full of hubris today. My government this, my government that, resounding victory. I quickly remind him he got a primary vote of 34%. The Coalition got a primary vote of 32%, and all other parties and individuals got a primary of 33%. A resounding victory and endorsement of his platform it does not make.
But we have a preferential voting system, and clearly the tendency of the electorate was not to vote for your side of politics, right?
Well, you would know, PK, there were some very interesting preferences arrangements and attempted preferences arrangements, may I say, across the Australian body politic at the last election, which no doubt will be excellent fodder for academics and others alike to study. Nevertheless, he got roughly the same primary vote that Bill Shorten got back in 2019 and did not manage to win. So this time it has produced quite a different outcome, and the Prime Minister thinks that gives him carte blanche to do whatever he wants, but it does not. And we will be forcefully holding him to account for the promises he has made, his delivery of them, his boosting of things like productivity, his ability to get the Australian economy back on track, and indeed things like the emissions targets, which last time I looked, they're not on track to achieve and in fact emissions are now going up, not down.
All right. Jerome, I just want to bring you in. Well, firstly, you can respond to the critique there by Zoe, but I also want to ask you about comments you made today in relation to having sort of a climate trigger or climate considerations, however you want to frame them, into environmental laws. Perhaps respond to Zoe first and then tell us why you think we need to do this.
Thanks, PK. Well, I certainly wouldn't use the word settled to describe the Coalition's position on net zero. I mean, you see the South Australian Liberals, which have just resolved to get the federal government to drop it, led by Liberal Party Senator Alex Antich. Then you've got, of course, the Nationals. And this is the problem for MPs like Zoe, who may agree with net zero, is that if you vote for people like them, you get these other really loud and disruptive voices on net zero. Let's not forget that net zero by 2050 is the bare minimum we need to do to reduce the impacts of climate change. And I think the Liberals have a lot of soul searching to do. If they can't, I mean, sometimes it looks like they can't even agree to what day of the week it is. To come now and try and say that their position on net zero is settled is a bit rich, I think. We'll see how that plays out. But contrast that with what we're doing. We now have received 2 mandates to continue on emissions reduction, 2 mandates to continue on our energy transition, and yes, environmental law reform and a new environmental protection agency at the federal level is part of that. We need to reform these laws. We're operating under laws that John Howard wrote in 1999, the last millennium. Things have moved on and community expectations have as well.
But that's different to what was proposed by your government. You want actually a climate trigger, so climate considerations are considered.
Well, the environmental law reforms weren't brought to the last parliament. We brought an EPA to the last parliament, and you've covered the reasons why that didn't get through. What I do take heart in is that the Minister Murray Watt has said that this is a priority, both an EPA being established and new environmental law reforms, so that further considerations can be made when assessing high emitting applications, and that's really important. A lot of the commentary about when applications are approved is that's how narrow the scope is for the Environment Minister. And you just heard from Matt Keane there, a respected voice in this space. More things should be considered, and I wouldn't call it a climate trigger, but at very least, the Minister should consider the impact of proposals on our emissions reduction targets.
2035 targets will be the next big moment, Zoe, and I spoke to Matt Keane. He made it clear that they're consulting 500 submissions, that he made the real case for what he sees as a crisis with the climate and need for action. That's going to be a really important moment, I suppose, for the opposition. What's your instinct on this?
Oh, to be fair, I haven't been focused on 2035, Patricia. I've been focused on my own electorate, as you would fully expect, and thinking about what the good folk of Flinders need in this term of government and how I will go about getting that for them from opposition. It is an important consideration. I am very much looking forward to watching the Murray Watt show. He's got to handle and wrangle the Greens in the Senate. He's got to handle and wrangle his own ambitious backbench, including Jerome, with his own proposals, the opposition within the government itself. It will be good to watch, but I don't at this point have a view on 2035, and I don't want to step into territory that is not my own. Dan Tehan will be coming back on that with a settled view from the Coalition in due course.
All right. There was an interview a little earlier with former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. He's written a big essay, worth reading actually, very interesting, on how to deal with the Trump era in a free trade context particularly, and also the defence space. But he said something really interesting. Jerome, I'm going to put it to you first. He said, no deal is better than a bad deal when it comes to dealing with Donald Trump, and that next dealing will be on the sidelines potentially of the G7. Do you agree with that sentiment, that it's better that Australia walks out without a deal than actually compromising a couple of key things?
Well, I think we've shown to do that on the international stage already. You cast your mind back to early on in our first term in our negotiations with the European Union and the EU free trade agreement, where we couldn't come to an agreement on geographical indicators, and we said, look, we're just going to have to go back. It's heartening to see that those negotiations have started once again. But we've shown that we'll always advocate for the national interest. And yes, when there's no point just signing a deal just to say we've got a deal. It's got to be good for Australia, good for our interests, and I'm confident that we'll get that same approach as we took with the EU, also with the US.
Yeah, it's interesting, Zoe McKenzie. Malcolm Turnbull basically framed it this way, that if you go in desperately trying to get any deal, that you can actually compromise too much. Is he right there, that we have to be very careful about what we offer?
Oh, absolutely. And that is generally the guiding principle across all free trade agreements. I would jump in, though, on the EU deal. That's one that's close to both Jerome and my heart. We co-preside the Parliamentary Friends of France, and I look after the EU as well.
Oh, I didn't know I had these French lovers here.
Yes,
okay, that's good to know.
You have the Francophile team on the TV today, but that deal, as I understand it, was scuppered much more because of the union influence than it was about geographic indicators. The European Union had given some ground. Feta was going to be able to be called Feta. Those things that had come from a European provenance were going to be looked after, and indeed there was more to come in terms of access to European markets, particularly for red meat. But one day in October, in Japan of all places, Don Farrell walked in and said, "No deal, no deal," walking away, and everyone was quite perplexed. And we have all sat on our hands for 18 months while that deal could have been finalised, could have been implemented, and Australians could be enjoying preferential access to European markets as we speak. Nevertheless, the Labor Party has finally got the message and gone back to the negotiating table with the European Union. And I do hope that we see a good result there sooner rather than later. We need to diversify our markets. It is very important. And Australia has extremely valuable exports, including critical minerals, that we need to make sure we are selling to like-minded friends. So I look forward to that deal finally being done.
Okay. Jerome, a bit of a critique there from your other French lover in relation to not doing a deal yet on the EU. Was it just a case of walking away? And what's different now? Why would the EU provide us a better deal now?
Well, the global economy has changed, and we've seen how important it is to establish really close trading relationships with like-minded partners. So I think there's a bit more of a impetus to get a deal signed. You'll have to chat to my very good colleague and excellent Trade Minister, Don Farrell, as to the reasons for that. But I think the overarching sentiment is that we will sign a deal that is good for Australia and not just sign a deal for the sake of it, be it with the US or the EU. And I think that's a pretty good approach to take.
All right, we're out of time. You've been a great panel. I'd love to get you on together again. Thank you.